So the Canalside Press it is sat in the offices of Lynch Architects, physically and financially, and I suppose intellectually. And we're doing a kind of extended field of architectural production, if that's not too pretentious, whereby the stuff that we do, buildings that we do, are one expression of a series of interests. And the word of making, which characterizes our practice of lots of physical models and a kind of production, is echoed in the or complemented by the library that we have. And I have actually written a number of books and published one with a German academic press, which wasn't a very satisfying experience, and 2 books with Artifice, which was an imprint of Black Dog, who sadly went out of business a few years ago. And in fact, Civic Ground was the last book we published. And so we, as part of the kind of the deal that you have as an author with that type of publisher, you get a number of books to sell. So we basically became a bookseller. And so we were kind of packaging and sending out books. I think I can now come out as a poet, having recently been shortlisted for the Bridport Prize. But in 2012, when we were invited to participate in the Venice Biennale by David Chipperfield, I wrote an essay and I published a poem that was written about my father when he died. And so I've been slowly trying to find a way to bring poetry and architecture together in a serious and consistent manner. So this is the office basically yesterday. And in an ad hoc way, we began publishing a journal about civic architecture, which concludes with poems. These are some pages from the most recent issue. This is the forthcoming issue, issue 6, where there's an interview with Craig Hamilton, a photographic survey of the City of London by Grant Smith, Ross Barr's really beautiful project for St Augustine's Church in Hammersmith, and some paintings by her client, who was the parish priest, Giovanni Notarini. Shahid Selim's study of ad hoc informal architecture of British mosques, which is going to be the British Pavilion next year, and Caroline Wirt's extension of her PhD study into Hansland Land. So these are the 3 books, and this is becoming a series of photography books. We've another planned with Mark Durkin and Zhao Liao about the occupied spaces of our various Caesars architecture. A book on John Mounier, which is a part of a series which we're calling Modern Architecture in Reflection, which includes, as you saw, forthcoming books on Robin Walker, John Spence, relatively unknown but a very accomplished London architect, and Neve Brown, along with David Porter, who was his colleague and business partner on the latter projects in Holland, and Paul's book. And so this is David Randall's book. It's a book of photography. There's an interview with David Campany, who's an old friend of mine from a village called Twyford in Berkshire. I think we're the only 2 that escaped. David's now runs the Centre for Photography in Manhattan. And Paul Shepheard, who David Randall had got to know, because he was, like me, was a fan of Paul's writing. So I invited Paul to write something about David, and he did so. This is what On Intricacy looks like. It's a mixture of interviews, archive photography, new photography, writing by critics. This is architects, in fact, who are writing as critics. Simon Henley and John Mounier's own work. So it's a kind of funny thing, this Canalside Press. It's not, I'm loosely affiliated with Liverpool University as an honorary professor, but I don't have tenure. It's not work for the research exercise framework. It doesn't make any money. It allows us to to explore ways of writing about and thinking about architecture from the point of view primarily of inspiration. So one aspect of that is the kind of moral and ethical inquiry into late modernist architecture, or proto-postmodern architecture, if you will, trying to uncover the intellectual dimension to this. It's often seen both by critics in favour of modernism and critics against modernism as intellectually vacuous, and that's not the case at all. Neve Brown in particular was a very good writer, as was Robin Walker. So that's a kind of more closely linked, I guess, to practical practice. And then, like a lot of things in life, you sort of have an idea, start doing it, and then I think retrospectively try to work out what you're doing. Dalibor Vesely, who taught me, was fond of pointing out that concept for the Greeks is what came at the end of a process of imaginative thought, not before it. It summarises it. And so then we kind of got into conversation with David, and he was around having a cup of tea and a slice of cake, and we thought, oh, let's make a book together. And then the same with Paul, was like, oh, let's do a book together. And it's had a kind of ad hoc beginning. But I realised the other day that in my library, that these are my favourite books that I have at home. And they're all, in some ways, hybrids. This is Rickard, one of my teachers. It's a memoir. It's not an autobiography. He insists it's a memoir of places, significant architectural, spatial experiences. This is Gerhard Richter's diaries as a practitioner. Essays by the poet Joseph Brodsky. This guy, if you don't know him, is probably the best English prose stylist of the 20th century, apart from maybe John Thomson. Teju Cole is a critic and a photographer. Calasso, one of my heroes, is a publisher, and who wrote about myth. Oliver Sacks, a neurologist, a medical doctor, and a brilliant writer. Novel by a poet. So I realised that I'm really attracted to people who aren't necessarily doing the thing you'd expect them to do. And Paul is an architect, and he's taught at a number of universities, including University of Texas at Austin, and in various London schools, the RCA, etc. But he writes in a way that is not what you'd expect an academic architect to write. And in many ways, it's exactly what the Canalside Press is attempting to do, is to create an outlet from academics who are harassed by vice-chancellors to get funding from organisations to publish things that are not necessarily close to their heart, and to create a forum for things which otherwise kind of stay within conversations in the pub. And so Paul's books, which are very much written, I think, for students, and for those of us who are still students of architecture. This is one of my favourite books ever, What is Architecture? Artificial Love, The Cultivated Wilderness. I mean, the titles are just wonderful. And just Alice asked me to say a bit about the series, so bear with me, Paul, I'm almost there. This is our next book, which is coming out in March next year to coincide with an exhibition retrospective of Tom Dupoir's first 25 years in practice at the Carlo Art Centre. Is a 12,000 plus word prose poem that began life as a series of project specifications and have become thematized around Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, the first man to look back at the globe as an orb, and to try to discuss questions of spatiality and the unreal character of architectural writing. Will Jennings, some of you may know of, he teaches at the Bartlett. Will's a curious character. I think he studied architecture to start with, and then fine art. He's also a brilliant writer, and someone I think who perfectly fits this kind of hybrid condition of working between the visual and the more kind of psycho-historical, autobiographical investigation into landscape. Alex Niven is another curious hybrid character, a very, very talented man. He was quite a famous rock star about 15 years ago, gave that up to do a PhD at Oxford in the English department, is now a lecturer at Newcastle University, and published a very interesting book recently called New Model Island, about the need for a federalised UK. He's also an accomplished poet, and is a Geordie, and so the book is a kind of love song to the music scene of his youth in the nightclubs of Newcastle, which I know about to some degree because both my brother and sister went to Newcastle University, so I was kind of involved in the 90s and the kind of specifically the sort of soul music scene there. And Adam Shah, who's some of you may know is the head of school there, a very, very good writer. So that's a kind of forthcoming collaboration. And through doing a PhD, which I did between 2009 and 2015, I interviewed quite a number of people, Rickard and Moneo and Vesley, and at various points when I've been employed as a journalist, I interviewed Peter Zumthor for the AJ, and the Joker has every issue an interview with de Boar, Mounier. The Mounier interview turned into a book. Craig Hamilton's forthcoming, Kate McIntosh, which may turn into a book. Burke and Howard. I realised that what I'm doing is I'm really interested in the imagination, and I think because I'm not a historian, an academic historian, nor am I a journalist. I'm just somebody who's interested in this stuff as a practitioner. So I kind of feel that people should be given freedom to talk about what they're most interested in at the moment, and Ellis has some part to play in this story because he first commissioned a series of articles from Paul for the BD when he was the editor, and I think Slogans and Battlecries was a kind of polemical title suggesting that they're things to cause confrontation and to cause dialectic, called development of a dialectical kind of movement. And so the book is structured into three parts, kind of polemical, material, and I suppose reflective. And it's organised. Paul calls them prose poems. The closest I can think about what this is like, those you may know of a very brilliant Italian writer and chemist called Primo Levi, who survived, I think it was Auschwitz. All of his family were murdered, and he was a commercial chemist. So he worked in the production of paints and chemicals for various industries, and he wrote fiction, and probably his greatest masterpiece, if not now, when it's a book called The Periodic Table, where there are a series of the elements of the periodic table. Each one is turned into a short story, whereby partly the character or the characteristics of the material element or non-material gas or mineral are seen as having almost the role of a kind of psychic protagonist to play in the stories that evolve. I studied this for A-level English, and it's stuck in my mind as being a model for a kind of cross-fertilization of expertise in one area, in Paul's case, the building regulations and materials, and a poetic sensibility that I don't think we talk about enough in architectural discourse. And it seems to fall in between the cracks of the kind of PR world of architectural publishing projects on the one hand, and the world of academic research on the other. And so the Canalside Press is really a sort of, hopefully, a site where people can expose themselves and in a playful, elliptical manner, reveal some profound truths about the architectural imagination. I think that Paul's done this in an extremely witty and insightful manner, and hopefully he'll be able to respond to that challenge accordingly. That's all I have to say. Over to you, Paul.
Okay. Thanks, Paddy. I must say it's a pleasure to have you as a publisher. You're one of the few architects, one of the few practicing architects I know who is genuinely interested in the words, as well as the drawings and the buildings. But I am an architect too. I'm not a practicing architect. This came through the post the other day. Can you see that at the top? It says AR, does that say ARB or BRA? It's back to front, isn't it? How does that work? Why does this camera give us a mirror image? It's not bra, it's ARB. They're inviting me to renew my registration so that I can continue to call myself. And when people ask me what I do, I say I'm a writer. And this letter turns up every year about this time, and I have to think about whether I'm going to renew it or not, because am I an architect or not? Well, no, I'm a writer. And then people say, what do you write about? And I say, well, architecture. And I'm not quite sure how it's happened. I think it's just architecture is such a rich, generous subject. It's got lots and lots of room in it for movement. And most of all, I like the way it straddles the line between the material world and the lived world. I think I'm stuck with architecture. I think I'm just about to embark on another book about architecture, and so I'm not going to escape it. I have a fairly wide definition about architecture, as was written down in Artificial Love, which is, I can do it in a sentence, I think, if I can remember it. The material of the world rearranged to suit human ends. And this has a backstory, this sentence, about what each of those pieces of the sentence means. And lately I've come to realize material is a contentious word. Did you know that? Material is contentious, as is human, difficult words to use. But that's where I'm coming from, and I think the difficulty is going to be resolved in my next book, I hope. Now, this is partly a book about theories. The first big architectural theory I understood was complexity and contradiction. That happened when I was a student. And, you know, I was like everybody else reading McLuhan and Tom Wolfe, and the Venturas came along with this one, which I'm now going to read a bit about. I know it dates me, but generational difference is a source of great pleasure, I find. Now I'm going to read this. This is a bit of an experiment because these are not read, they're not written to be listened to, they're written to be read. So we'll see how this goes. It's called Less is a Bore. The slogan is Less is a Bore. Less is a Bore was a joke. It's a reversal of the Misesian modernist mystic of less is more. It asserted the funk of lived life against graph paper buildings that use less is more as a way of not having to pay for the lively parts. Venturis rode in on the back of pop art in 1966, and their reversal of Mises' slogan had impact because the veneration of the original had become so stultifying. Turning less is more upside down appealed to everyone who found architectural complexity thrilling. It took a while for the modernists to regroup and start dismissing Venturi's thing as POMO, which was short for postmodern, which itself was shorthand for it's just another style. But in that time, meaning seeped back into architecture and it never went away again. The problem with the simple version is that the paradoxical composite structure that the fire regulations forced on Mises' minimal dreams, a steel building covered in concrete and then faced again with steel, it's its own kind of thrilling. The world shows itself to be thoroughly complex at all times. The moderns may have driven meaning in architecture back to the boundary, but it was just lying in wait, keeping its head low as the bullets of 20th century purity whistled overhead. So why did Venturi, a smart guy, not see that? Slogans are provisional arrangements. They're fires lit in the forest when people have stopped seeing the wood for the trees. Clumsy signs pointing in a new direction. Less is a bore did not survive its own desire for complexity, which has since engulfed architectural theory and blizzards of words. The weird thing is that less is more, riding the backlash against all that, is as portentous and powerful as ever. That's 300 words. To read 300 words takes 2 minutes, which is, I always think of it as a 2-minute silence. You know, when you're in a big hall and you have a 2-minute silence, and the first minute is difficult to get through, but the second minute is transcendent. And I wish we could do it now, but you can't do that on Zoom because there's no tension between the people. So that was my first big theory. The first slogan I can remember, first architectural slogan I can remember having anything to do with was firmness, commodity, and delight, which I guess my dad taught me when I was 12 years old. And you know, Paul, it means firmness is how well it's built, and commodity means how useful the program is, and delight is how pretty it is. And that's pretty useless as a slogan for architecture. It purports to describe everything about architecture, but it doesn't. And when you start looking at the different words in there, they get very tangled and pregnant with meanings. And I can remember a conversation with Zaha Hadid. We were both teaching at the AA. Firmness is the architect's intention. That's what makes a building strong, is the architect's intention. She used to talk a lot of good sense, Zaha. She was terrifying, but she talked a lot of good sense. And part of the issue with firmness, commodity, and delight, it being my introduction to theories of architecture, was how to construe this muddle, how to untangle this thing. And when I embarked on writing What is Architecture, I thought at the time that my job was to clear up confusions. I thought that's what teachers and people who wrote about things were to do. They were to clear up confusions. And now I think it's skewed a bit to actually tracing the confusions themselves, because they're so amusing and so lively. And they may even be the delightful thing in themselves. I'm going to read another. This is one about Cedric Price. Remember Cedric Price? You remember Zaha Hadid? You remember Cedric Price? Yeah, I know. This one's called I Reserve the Right to Distort Time. You would think that all slogans and battle cries would merit an exclamation mark, but this positively can't do without one. Picture Cedric Price standing behind a lectern, spidery image behind him, glass of brandy in front of him, jagging his finger at the ceiling and shouting, I reserve the right to distort time. Hardly anyone in the crowded room knows what he's talking about. Price gives lectures about perceptions so freshly minted that the experience is like being in a dark room a half second after someone has snapped the lights on. He goes on, old age, changes in level. He's listing architectural verities to his stunned audience, a list so personal you have to love him to bear it, which everyone there does. The edge. And then he shows us an image of the Moonlight Towers in Austin, Texas, which distort time by turning night to dusk. In the 1890s in the Wild West, the new city dammed the Colorado River to make hydroelectric power and got a recreational lake as well, and then used some of the electricity for a grid of tall light towers which glimmer bright as a new moon, just bright enough to read your watch by. This delightful compound of actions and results was Price's sort of architecture, a lightweight architecture that came and went under the cloak of invisibility. 40 years on, what can we make of his futures, which were so embedded in their times? The Think Belt, a university on a moving train like the land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles. Fun Palace, building so diagrammatic you can't make out what fun it is. A non-plan, where no planning permission is required. At the time, startlingly progressive, but at this distance, neoliberal. You could lose time completely in such distortions. So I wrote some books about architecture, and this project came about, as Paddy mentioned, because of Ellis Woodman, who was editor of BD at the time. And I guess this is about 2012 or 2011 maybe. And I had run into a serious problem with my younger son, Felix, who's profoundly epileptic. And caring for him was taking up a great deal of time, and all the time for reflection that one needed for writing books wasn't available to me anymore. And I didn't know what to do about it. And Ellis commissioned me to write a couple of pieces which were journalism. And I thought, I'm not a journalist, I'm a writer. And he explained it to me. I think it was you, Ellis, who explained this to me, that writing books is like taking a trek across the countryside. Every night you pitch a tent, you light a fire, you make a camp. Next morning you pack it all up, you go on with the journey. Journalism is like diving into a swimming pool, swimming to the other end and jumping out. It's not a question of quality, it's a question of process. And my daughter's a journalist in New York, and she has corroborated this view. In fact, it may be her who told me this analogy, I'm not sure. But she said, why don't you put them on Instagram? I said 300 words, they're so short really, 300 words, it's really difficult to do. And she said, why don't you put them on Instagram? That's what I'm doing. Which was obvious really, now I think about it. I didn't understand anything about it at all. How do you do it? How do you, Instagram's pictures, how do you do it? She said, no, there's plenty of room for words. You just email yourself the text and paste it in. It works, Dad, believe me. So I did it. But I'm grateful to Ellis for having offered me these 300-word chunks, because it doesn't seem like much. It's true, and you have to commit yourself to being a journalist and not a writer. It's true, but 300 words is a wonderful elastic length. You can, if you read any of the first sentences of these things, you'll see the diving board where I just jumped into it. But then there's the length of these. The length is, you can give a lot of length with 300 words and pass it up at the end. And they are exactly 300 words, not the regulations and the materials, but the slogans are all exactly 300 words long. And I came to think of them as poems because of this metric of 300 words. Because like all poetical metrics, it does force you to make decisions, and it forces you to précis, and forces you to be brief. I see Vicky's opening a bottle of wine. I'll have to wait. Now I've lost the thing. You know, with a sonnet, you get 14 lines. You get a rhyming pattern of the first two and the first two, and then one more, and that repeats down the end. And you have an iambic pentameter, so that you've got to fit everything into 10 syllables. It's a terrific constraint, that sonnet thing, and the metrics of it, and 300 words with just a single metric. I was very engaged with this. I think it's like Gertrude Stein, you know, a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose, she says. I think that line, the rose, became truer than it's been for 400 years. It's sort of devaluation of meaning to go with one, but go with one I have done. Now I'm going to read you one called Save the Planet, which is my daughter's favorite. She picked it out for me. It's on page 54. Here we are, Save the Planet. Diving board. Everyone knows what this means, but although everyone who's not sticking their head in the sand knows what to do, none of them knows how to do it. Some people, call them creationists, dispute the necessity, saying that the Earth has been spinning around the sun for 4 billion years, generating and surviving atmospheric extremes as it goes. The Earth saves itself. Others, fatalists, dispute the possibility, saying that global warming is inevitable. If it's human-made, it's too late to stop it. If it's another spin of the cycle that produces the ice ages, whatever that is, then it's too big to stop. Some people knuckle down to sorting out their own personal sustainability, doing what they can do, regardless of the larger inaction. You could call them Protestants. They see the irony of life generating its own catastrophic end, and say that it's not the planet that needs saving, but our own selves. Creationists, fatalists, and Protestants, schismatic terms, they help to make this a picture of competing faiths, a rumbling crowd of discord. It could be illustrated by one of those Victorian paintings of Armageddon, where the plates of the earth are turning upside down, and the unconverted, the larger in action, are tumbling into the molten depths. Back to network theory, and the mouth of Latour says the ultimate catastrophe is unsolvable because we cling to identity. Our very humanism is against us. We need a single figure for the biomass that can act to a collective program that will save the planet. We need, in short, a dictator. But the only dictators our democracies can manufacture are fascist nationalists who can't see past their own noses. They lack the imagination for worldwide action. We need someone in whom everyone can believe. Oh, Christ. Do we need another Jesus? Okay. So there are 50 of those slogans. And the regulations came along as I was looking for an extension to the project, and the regulations, I was very engaged by the encyclopedic way they're laid out. A, structure; B, fire safety; C, site preparation, resistance to contaminants and moisture; D, toxic substances, etc., all the way through to R. And I began to think of them as, I was writing in much the same way as slogans, but because I think I started, sorry, I'm confusing. I started because I was trying to explain the Grenfell Tower disaster to someone who didn't understand what had happened and thought, everybody lives in tower blocks and safe, we're going to die in fires? And I realized then that the regulations are not about building construction, they're about building use. They're put there to save the users of the buildings from bad buildings. When I realized that they were about use, the whole thing became much more personal. And so the regulations, in spite of what you might think, are more personal in tone than the slogans. This one's called B1, means of warning and escape. I'm just going to sneak a look at my watch here. Means of warning and escape. It was in my year-out job that I first learned about the profundities of means of escape in case of fire. I also learned how to draw. Sitting at the next desk was a man old enough to be my grandfather, a German emigre who'd made his name in his 20s by pioneering buildings with 75mm ferrous concrete walls. There's inadequate reinforcement cover at that thickness. The buildings all failed, and so consequently did he. Thanks to the charity of our boss, Gerd Kaufmann, he'd washed up at the end of his life, sitting next to me in Gerd's office and waxing philosophical. He drew construction drawings on tracing paper with HB pencil, which was very soft. The rest of us used 2H. I tried it, and soon we had a friendly competition going, using softer and softer leads until we finally hit 2B and drew a line under it. Gerd was one of those whose education had been interrupted by the Hitler War, which he'd spent in the army. He didn't regret it because half his family had died in Birkenau and it was his personal war. But when peace came, he enrolled as a mature student in architecture school, 5 years late and itching to get on with it. He regarded planning permission and fire brigade approval as red tape designed to delay his progress, and so dispatched me, 22 years old and knowing nothing at all, to see the fire officer responsible for the flats we were building at Mill Lane in Camden. They had tiny balconies at the higher levels so occupants could escape directly into the flat next door. The fire officer, his face creased with emotion, taught me this valuable lesson, that every piece of the schedule, every travel distance in meters or fire rating in hours, every access regulation and piece of signage had been arrived at through bitter experience of lives lost in fires. Gerd is long gone now, but I wish I could thank him today for these lessons learned and to teach him one. Planning permission is not a bureaucratic inconvenience, it's a defense of socialist principles. Not even the owner has the right to develop land. without the permission of the community. You going all right, Liz? I want to read K4. No, K2, protection from falling. My children and I are having a day out at Wimpole Hall near Royston, Herts. My daughter is teasing her little brother about his big ears. Why does she do it? Because I can, she says. It's life, I tell him, get used to it. The house sits in a huge park that has been hardened by time. It has everything. Fallen tree trunks, ha-has, parterre gardens, human-made lakes with ancient sluices and weirs, a crumbling folly, and a mighty cattle sward with sheep tracks scrawled across it. Deep in the heart of all this is an old broken-down farm reservoir, roofed in corrugated iron and enclosed by a rusting, partially collapsed iron fence. And it is in a fallen piece of this fence that we find a sheep trapped by the horns, lying still, blinking but exhausted, with her lamb standing by her like innocence itself, unable to help. We approach as quietly as possible, and the lamb backs away but doesn't want to leave its mother. The ewe herself makes one more feeble kick but is held fast by the fence. She has obviously inserted her nose through the bars to get at some tasty-looking clump of grass, and the fence must have fallen in at the wrong moment, and now she's stuck fast. She cannot work out how to free her horns. I bend down and take hold of them and gently twist her neck until I can push them back through the bars, and she's suddenly free. She jumps up, vomits on the grass, and runs off, followed by the lamb. I tell my children not to put their heads through safety railings ever, because look what can happen. When my son tells me he has no horns, I point out that he does have big ears, and that might just do it. No, I don't, he says. I don't have big ears. And his sister says, what do you mean? They're as big as a giraffe's. Yeah, I said everything I've written down, except for this last bit, which is about the third section of the trilogy, which is, to my regret, a bit shorter than the other two, but and I can't explain why that is. I ground to the by the time the 50th Slogan and Battlecry came around, I was appealing to people for help with them. The building regulations were all laid out. I had them all set out for me, and the materials, well, materials came along one after another. Reflection and action, reflection in action. I've just been reading Karen Barad and hearing that reflection is what old-fashioned people do, because it's all about words, and it's about representation of concepts in words, which isn't good enough. It's not as good as what the physicians do, who use diffraction grids to discover differences in things. Reflection means bend again. Diffract means break up into pieces, which I think is maybe the difference between poetry and physics. I'm not sure. Actually, I said I wasn't going to do this, didn't I? Because it belongs in another book. It's too complicated. And poems are not philosophies. I think they're partialities. They're like commitments. They're like species. In the theory of uniformitarianism, there's pieces of grit lying all over the landscape, which are the things that have committed themselves to being what they are. Like humans have committed themselves to be humans. And I'm just going to read one more of these. This one's called Concrete. It's in between chalk and copper. The materials have no order to them. They come out alphabetical. The regulations have an order because they do. And the slogans, well, actually, they're one after the other, but they're not alphabetical. They're just jumbled up. They're confusions. Anyway, this is called Concrete. There are people in this book. There's a couple called Billy and Ben, who are kind of sidekicks to argue out some of the things in slogans. There's my family, basically, in the regulations. And there's a bunch of office workers I invented to do concrete. And this one is Phoebe talking to Amir about concrete. Amir's from Iraq. Phoebe is trying to explain the idea of the glass ceiling to Amir. The glass is so brittle, he says. I prefer buildings made of concrete. She tries again. It's a figure of speech, she says. It's about how the way to the top appears clear, but there's an invisible barrier that stops it getting there. Way to the top, his expression says. If you're a woman, that is. Huh, says his face. You can see through the glass, but you can't get past it. She says it's made by men to keep their hold on power. You mean the partners? They do that? Suddenly he gets it. He looks up at the ceiling tiles. If those tiles were glass, you could see the soffit of the floor above, the concrete ceiling. He reaches over and pulls a book off the shelf, Paul Virilio's Bunker Archaeology. My favorite, he says. Look at them, all concrete, no glass. The buildings look lumpen, like huge cakes baked with gravel and cement. The gun portals glower as black as caves. No one gets past them, he says. I guess we'd have to call that a bunker mentality, says Phoebe, smiling. But the joke falls flat. Huh? It's another figure of speech. It means you use your prejudices as a bulwark against new ideas. Bulwark, I like the sound of that, says Amir. It sounds heavy. And how do you like the idea of a woman being promoted to partner? Would she be a heavy woman, he says? Phoebe imagines herself made of concrete, smashing through the glass. Like me, you mean? Yes. Yes, she would, she says. Bring it on, says Amir, punching the air. Read more and more of those, couldn't I?
Should we have some questions, perhaps? Paul, are you up for having a few questions from the audience?
Well, I'm always up for having a few questions, yeah. You know the story about Peter Eisenman. He jumps up on stage when he gives a lecture and he says, right, any questions? No lecture, just questions. But you have to be very well known to bring that one off.
Well, please let us know in the chat box if you'd like to ask Paul a question. I mean, I guess I've always I have a sense, Paul, that you've as a writer, you've always had a suspicion of the impulse to transfer literary ideas into an architectural discourse. I think you've talked about context as being fundamentally a kind of literary rather than an architectural idea.
Yeah.
You're always interested in talking ultimately about material facts.
Yeah, right. What do you write about? I write about the material world, it's true, and the relationship between humans and the material world. And context is one of those delightful confusions. I think it's about writing, and I think it's to explain how words accrue meaning from the words adjacent to them. And I don't think that buildings do that in the same way. I think buildings are next to each other rather than gaining power from each other. I think they are next to each other. I think they're in context by definition. There's a question from Shumi Bose. Sorry,
I've just got to follow up first. I mean, I'm struck that so many of the pieces you read, there's a sort of, you're really dismantling metaphors.
Yeah.
And
some people.
I wonder what did you think of the value of the metaphor as a device in ultimately in talking about architecture and ultimately designing architecture? Are you suspicious of that kind of import of a literary idea into an architectural field?
Yeah, What is Architecture was about exactly that. It was about the folly of doing that. And if I could remember the line I was taking on metaphor in that, is that metaphor is something used in place of another. Something used in place of another, which I think is more appropriate to architecture than in writing, actually. I think the words have a different way of approaching their subject than metaphor. And so what we're dealing with mostly in writing is similes. I think that was the line I was taking, What is Architecture? It's all got a lot more complicated than that for me now. And I'm not sure why it should get more complicated. Maybe life has just got more interesting over the years. But when I wrote What is Architecture, I was surrounded by literary analogy and philosophical analogy too. And this all seemed to be beside the point. And here was material, and here were these bits of wood which had to be sawn apart to get them apart. It had to be dismantled and reconstructed. And I thought you were going to ask me or challenge me or accuse me of being a deconstructionist at some point in that sentence. You know, and it is a vague worry, isn't it? One is just simply being a deconstructionist. And I think maybe I'm a reconstructionist. You know, I'm still using all the parts, but I'm trying to bolt them back together in different ways.
We've got a question from Shumi. You can pitch it yourself if you want to
Sure.
speak.
I think it follows pretty decently from your own question, Alice, but maybe in the inverse. So my question to Paul, hello Paul, by the way, really enjoyed hearing you read some of those, was how you, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you use fiction, the fictional characters of Billy and Ben and the others, and kind of the sense of narrative to talk about architectural ideas or ideas about space and living. Because that's quite unique, I think. Sometimes theory can be so tough to read because it's written in the abstract, but could you speak a bit about the way that you use fiction?
Well, I was taught a lesson very early on by Rickard, who was trying to be my agent when I first started writing. And she said, "This is no good. Your writing is icy cold. You've got to learn to use dialogue. You've got to have speaking parts." And I thought, I'm writing about architecture, I don't need speaking parts, but she persuaded me to try it, and it was a revelation. I mean, part of the reason for doing dialogue is to have space on the page. Did you know that? So that because of the paragraph breaks, you just open the page out and get a bit of air in there. And that's fundamentally about what it does for you. But I find it exhilarating when a character walks in and says something, then other things happen from that. And this character Billy, of course, she's based on 3 or 4 people, maybe one in particular, but she has a certain way of approaching the world. And Ben is her sidekick, who has a completely different way of approaching the world. And so I could use these two, as a writer, I could use these two to put positions which weren't my own, and I could comment on their positions which weren't my own. Although I think they probably were my own because I was making them up, if you see what I mean. And that springs from dialogue and inventing the characters to do it. And you know what playwrights say about writing plays is that the actors do all the work for you. At least this is what the actors say. You don't have to worry about putting in emotion or description or anything, because the actors are going to put everything in there for you. And I'm not sure about that, because if you read a play, if you read a Thomas Stoppard play or even a George Bernard Shaw play, the vivacity comes rolling off the page at you because of the dialogue and because of the dialogue as a device for writing with dialogue rather than writing descriptively. I think this is what you're asking me, isn't it? What have I missed out?
Yeah, very much. No, I think that's perfect. And the characters certainly, it reads to me like that, like they're allowing you to cleave open a different way of looking at something. It's just not something that very many people are encouraged to do.
They can say ridiculous things apart from anything else, or they can say insightful things. they can be sudden about it, they can react in unpredictable ways, which means an argument doesn't have to proceed one thing after another. It can suddenly jump somewhere else because of something somebody said. So I find it invaluable to write characters, and I suppose that puts me more on the edge in terms of what Paddy was talking about, of being out of the academic mainstream, because you don't do that in academic writing. At least I don't
It's
think.
reminding me of people who perhaps don't think about the characters who inhabit their buildings, but perhaps put render ghosts in, and those characters need to speak, and I think that's what I found in your writings. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thanks for the question. And the term render ghosts, that's a good one too. Did you make that up?
Someone more poetic than me.
I wonder what if Anne offered the same advice to Joseph, Rickard, but I have yet to encounter the
I don't know.
Joseph's with some fictional characters popping up.
Yeah, I don't know. I got to know Joseph through my parents, of course, the Rickards through my parents, and I had an interesting run-in with him. Maybe I shouldn't say this. Should I say it? It was when my fourth book, How to Like Everything, had been rejected by the MIT Press, and it took me really, really badly, this rejection. And I complained a lot about it. And the commissioning editor said, "Look, Paul, we don't do memoirs, right? You're writing memoirs." He meant that the dialogue has got out of hand, that the book is hardly about architecture anymore. You're just writing a memoir. We don't do that at the MIT Press, which now I can understand what he was saying. But at the time, I was very hard done by it, and I went about complaining all the time. And I found myself sitting behind Joseph at a lecture, at one of the Bob Evans lectures in Westminster. And we were both there. And, "Hello, Paul, how are you? Haven't seen you for ages. Hello, everything's fine, Joseph. How's Anne?" And he said, have you heard from Roger lately? Roger being the commissioning editor at MIT. "Have you heard from Roger lately?" And I said, "Yeah, he just rejected my book." He said, "That's funny. He's just rejected mine too." By which he meant this memoir book, I think. Is that the same book, Patrick? Is it a Routledge book?
Well, an error.
An error.
We're at an error.
Yeah.
But
Well, I don't know. I felt quite good about it, obviously, because to be level pegging with Rickard on this matter was quite an honour, I thought. To be both rejected for the same reason by the same publisher.